Let's bring into the conversation now our trusty colleague there at Fox News Radio who covers all things Capitol Hill. That's reporter Ryan Schmelz. He joins me. Ryan, happy Friday here. So they got it done. They got it over the finish line. Is anyone surprised?
I don't think people are necessarily surprised. This was a pretty low number for the most part, about $9 billion. Now, there were changes that were made to this. Remember, they started off with about $9.4 billion. You had $400 million that was clawed back related to what's called PEPFAR, which is a program passed during the Bush administration that goes to combating HIV and AIDS in countries like Africa, or in continents like Africa and in other countries across the world. So this was something that was kind of sounded the alarm from some members like Don Bacon of Nebraska. You had Mitch McConnell had issues with it too. There was an amendment. They took that part out. And while there were some House members who were a little disappointed that it was watered down a little bit, it was still $9 billion and still a spending cut. So that was enough to get it across the finish line back in the House.
So, Ryan, what about some of these Republican fiscal hawks who say this is just a drop in the bucket, $9 billion, when you want to take into account the overall budget debt and deficit here? What are they saying?
Well, it is just a drop in the bucket. They're absolutely right. There's only $9 billion, but in many ways, this is kind of seen as a test run for future rescission packages. The White House has to request this, and then Congress can approve it on a simple majority. So we are likely to see some new ones down the road. Speaker Johnson has straight up said that he wants to see more rescission packages in the near future. So we'll see what the White House comes up with next time. And I think there is some thought that there could be some things that could be bipartisan. You think about animal testing, which has come under a lot of scrutiny at the NIH and some other healthcare agencies when it comes to their research. There's been some bipartisan bills. Maybe the administration could take a look at that. That could be something that might be bipartisan. But there are some other things here that certainly are a point of contention amongst Republicans and amongst Democrats. And you saw that with Republicans here, where a lot of them were very hesitant to cut funding for PBS and NPR, especially after you saw those floods in Texas, where a lot of rural areas across the country are dependent on public broadcasting or some type of broadcast network when it comes to a severe weather event.
So, Ryan, what happens to NPR and PBS? They still have private funding, right?
Oh, yes. This was not all of their funding whatsoever. They get funding from other streams. This was kind of a drop in the bucket for them as well. Now, it's still a significant number. It's in the billions of dollars, but they still have their ways of making money other ways too.
So, Ryan, I have to ask, because we saw really two historic milestones really back to back in the House over the last week and a half. The longest open votes ever. Why? What was going on there? Why did these votes take so long to wrap up?
Well, at this point, I can't keep track of which ones are which because there's so many different times in which we have a vote that stays open for a significant amount of time. But in this case, it seemed as though this was the crypto legislation where you had a number of lawmakers who, I think going into the week, GOP leadership thought they had the votes or thought that they would at least get on the floor without any issues. But you saw this procedural vote called the rule, which is what needs to pass in order for it to get on the floor. Normally, when you do a rule vote, you have all people from the party in power will vote with the party, even if they're going to vote no on final passage. And then Democrats will do the exact opposite. They'll vote no on the rule. Even if they're going to vote yes on the final passage, they'll still vote no on the procedural hurdle because of how it works. But in this case, and pretty much going back to the last Congress, Republicans have in many ways tanked a lot of these procedural votes. And you saw that happen with this crypto legislation where the vote was pretty much kept open for a significant amount of time while Speaker Johnson and some other members of GOP leadership were taking these holdouts off the floor, having meetings, trying to get them to yes so they can move this legislation forward. Ultimately, they were able to do that, but they set a record in the meantime.
So the vote there on rescissions was 216 yeas, 213 nays here. How are Democrats going to politically wield this here? Is anyone, Democrats and Republicans alike, are they worried about primary challenges, electoral consequences due to the clawback of, what, $9 billion? Are we talking about that or no?
Well, where I think the fallout's going to be and what Democrats have been teasing, which could be a problem down the road, is the fact that starting now, between now and September, we potentially are facing a government shutdown. We have until the end of September to fund the federal government. And Democrats kind of see this as, okay, we can come to an agreement and pass something that will fund the government, But if Republicans don't like it, they can just offer a rescission package and then take that funding away later on. So Democrats are kind of having some trust issues right now because of this. And so I think the concerns about a possible government shutdown and questions of how are Republicans going to get 60 votes to fund the government when we get to the end of September or in the near future, I think that's kind of one of the big fallouts that's happening right now.
Okay, let's transition our conversation. Let's talk about what everyone's talking about. That's, of course, Jeffrey Epstein, because there are so many really strands that you can tease out about how this is now playing out on Capitol Hill. So the AP has it as follows. House Republicans were grasping late last night to formulate a response to the Trump administration's handling of records in the Epstein sex trafficking case, ultimately putting forward a resolution that carries no legal weight but nodded to the growing demand for greater transparency. So, Ryan, this is a House resolution. It could be voted on next week. What will it do? Who sponsored it? Who supports it? Who's against it?
Well, there's been a number of different pieces of legislation related to Jeffrey Epstein and releasing further information related to his investigation. Now, there were a couple of attempts by House Democrats to attach Epstein-related legislation to, for example, the rescission package. Republicans shot that down, but now there are discussions about what Republicans can do to get this information out there. And obviously, they're trying to walk a fine line here between what President Trump wants to do, respecting how Attorney General Pam Bondi wants to go about this. But at the same time, a lot of them really do feel passionately about getting the Epstein files out there and getting the information out there and being as transparent as possible. So I think we are looking at a number of pieces of legislation that could maybe make it to the floor next week. I think it depends on what the consensus is amongst Republicans and Democrats and what Speaker Johnson ultimately wants to do. But there are talks about putting out legislation that would pretty much declassify all the information related to Jeffrey Epstein.
So we're talking about two things. One is a non-binding resolution just for House members calling for the release of whatever material is still out there, and then actual legislation with teeth to force that here. So you kind of have these dual tracks playing out at the same time. But back to my question, especially for House Republicans here, who's for it and who's against it in that camp? Because we know, I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, many Democrats are kind of relishing in all of this. And so I think that they would be mostly on board for some type of vote to, release the full Epstein files, whatever that means. But Republicans, we know that there's this internecine battle playing out within the MAGA base. Is it playing out within factions of the Republican Party there in the House?
I would say so. Thomas Massey, who is obviously no fan of Donald Trump's, and Donald Trump is no fan of his, he's been one who's leading a piece of legislation that would declassify a lot of that information. Congressman Tim Burchett, considered to be a MAGA Republican, probably one of the what you would consider to be a GOP hardliner, especially on fiscal issues. He has been somewhat critical of Pam Bondi and how she's handled the Epstein files. So he's somebody who's been pushing for further declassification. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has said that he thinks the information should be declassified as well. Now, how he's going to go about that in terms of either a piece of legislation or just allow the Trump administration to handle this how they see fit, I think that's kind of still a lingering question. But you've got a number of Republicans who are definitely, jumping on board with pieces of legislation that would declassify the information related to Jeffrey Epstein. And I would say it's not, just different factions. It's a pretty mixed bunch for the most part.
Yeah, Ryan, Speaker Johnson said this: the House Republicans are for transparency, and they're looking for a way to say that they agree with the White House. We agree with the president. Everything he said about that, all the credible evidence should come out. It seems like they all agree that transparency is the word of the day, but can they agree on maybe the definition of transparency or what should be made transparent? That seems to be the sticking point.
It certainly does. And I think we still have to see what ultimately comes out from this latest push by Attorney General Pam Bondi and President Trump, where they said they're going to declassify the grand jury testimony related to Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not quite sure right now if that's going to be enough to satisfy everyone, because there still could be other documents out there. So what we probably will still see a legislative push early next week. Thomas Massey, Republicans who are in his camp. Obviously, Democrats are still going to push for this as well. But here's the thing. Democrats probably won't be able to attach this to a piece of legislation that they don't like the way they did with the rescission package and some of the other legislative pushes that Republicans had last week. So, yeah, how Democrats are going to react when pretty much this could be a standalone, I think that's kind of something to watch for as well.
All right. Ryan Schmelz there with Fox News Radio on Capitol Hill. Ryan, thanks so much. Have a good weekend.
You too, Andrew. Thank you.